Hey guys, what's going on? It's Ben here, and today I'm going to be doing a video regarding the 2003 to 2004 Dallas Mavericks. I am going to be talking a bit about their season, and actually mainly about why I think it is a very disappointing season overall, why I don't think that they met expectations, why they almost, I would say, underachieved immensely. I don't think that's too much of a stretch to say that they underachieved immensely. And moreover, just how they could have done better and why they ultimately didn't perform as well as they could have. So the reason that I wanted to make this video was mainly because I had been researching them a little bit, and well, just the Mavericks in general, and I was looking at their year-to-year records, and I realized that they basically had this really stacked roster and were not able to do much with it. And right now I'm actually looking something up just for the video to pull up and look at here quick. But just overall, I thought that they really did not perform as well as they could have, considering how good of a team they had and how much talent was on their roster. So just for a little bit of background, so in the year prior, in 2002 to 2003, the Dallas Mavericks finished with 60 wins. The main players on their team were Dirk Nowitzki, Steve Nash as his second in line, and then Nick Van Exel, sort of in a Jason Terry-esque role, like a sixth man off the bench, along with let's see here, who was the third guy on the team was, or the fourth guy, I should say. Well, let's see. The third guy on the team was, or fourth, excuse me, it was Nash, Nowitzki, Michael Finley. He was the fourth guy. He was a really good player. Not everyone is very familiar with his game, but I'd compare him to not quite as good as DeMar DeRozan, but let's see here. I'm trying to come up with an apt comparison. Like a much better version of Andrew Wiggins, like 20 points a game, but played defense and was efficient. So there you go. That's my closest comparison, I guess, that I can come up with. Pretty lanky, small forward, good shooter. He was a really solid player for that team. So then and in that 2003 playoffs, they got to the Western Conference Finals and lost to the Spurs, who ultimately went on to win the championship. But they were a 60-win team that got to the conference finals, which is pretty good for a team that hadn't had that much success before that. So then moving forward into the next season, let's see here. The Dallas Mavericks basically only lost Nick Van Exel because he went away in free agency, but they did bring in a lot of key pieces that were very helpful. They brought in Antawn Jamison, who was a guy who could score around 20 points a game for you and was really effective. They also brought in all-star Antoine Walker from the Celtics, who was still playing pretty well and still in his prime. Besides those two, they also drafted rookies Marquise Daniels and Josh Howard, who both played pretty well, both made the all-rookie second team and were effective. And they still retained Steve Nash and Dirk Nowitzki and Michael Finley. So they're still a solid team. I'd say, though, that they improved in that they basically gave up Van Exel and got like 3 solid rotation guys in Josh Howard, Walker, and Jamison. And so real quick, I'll read off some of their stats for the season just so you can get an idea of their regular season stats. So Marquise Daniels averaged 9 points a game in the regular season. Michael Finley averaged 19. Antawn Jamison won Sixth Man of the Year and averaged 15 points a game off the bench. Steve Nash averaged 15 and 9. Dirk Nowitzki averaged 22 points a game along with 9 rebounds. Antoine Walker averaged 14 points a game with 8 rebounds. So they had a pretty solid scoring core. Oh wait, Josh Howard as a rookie scored 9 points a game and 6 rebounds. So they really had some solid guys in that you could look to Finley, Jamison, Nash, Nowitzki, or Antoine Walker, all as viable scoring options in any given game. But mysteriously, they did only finish with 52 wins compared to the 60 the year before. And that's really odd to me because they had a better roster, I would say, overall. And looking at their team, no one really missed a significant amount of time. Finley played 72 games, Jamison 82, Walker 82, Nash and Dirk each 77 and 78. So of those 5 guys, all of them played 72 games or more, which is essentially the entire regular season. Their main starting lineup was Steve Nash at point, then Josh Howard and Michael Finley sort of flip-flopping who played shooting guard and who played small forward, and then Antoine Walker at the 4 and Dirk at the 5, and then they had Antawn Jamison coming off the bench as the 6th man. And overall they had a decent regular season. They finished as the 5 seed, and I think that the reason that their win total went down a lot, in my opinion, is because you saw a lot of teams that year jump. The Denver Nuggets got a lot better because they got Carmelo Anthony. The Lakers and Spurs were still as good as always. The Kings were still as good as they had been recently. The Grizzlies started to improve a lot. Pau Gasol started coming into his prime, so they improved quite a bit. And overall, you just saw the talent level rise a bit in the West, and I think as a result, the Mavs just lost a few more games just because it was a bit tougher. And the Timberwolves especially took a jump. They had always been like a 6, 7, or 8 seed, but this year Garnett played out of his mind. Sam Cassell probably had the best year of his career. Latrell Sprewell had a bounce-back year. Wally Szczerbiak played like a phenomenal 6th man. The T-Wolves had the best record in the NBA, I think, actually. They had the 2nd best record in the NBA, but they finished with the best record in the West at 58 wins, and so that was a big reason why the Mavs were a bit lower too at the 5 instead of being the 4 or the 3 seed. But really, we got to examine their playoff performances, and that looking at that is why they failed. So in the first round, they matched up against the Sacramento Kings, who they had actually played in the previous season in the playoffs and beaten. They beat them in, let's see here, in the 2004 playoffs. So in this current year we're talking about, they lost to them in 5 games, and they beat them in 7 games the prior year. So if we go back to the 2003 season, they beat them in 7 games. And really, I think if you look at it, it was a 7-game series, and Chris Webber really wasn't there for most of that 7-game series. He missed, I think, 4 games of that, or 3 games of that, and that's probably the reason that the Mavs won, honestly, is because Chris Webber, the Kings' best player, was out for most of the series. And I think the next year, the Kings might have just been a bit more hungry for the series than the Mavs were, and the Mavs really just underperformed, I'd say, because, so I'll read off some comparisons for how players played in the regular season compared to the playoffs. So a huge improvement in the playoffs was Marquise Daniel, who went up from 9 points a game to 16 and starting in the playoffs. Dirk Nowitzki went up from 22 points a game to 27 and 12 rebounds. But you had basically every other main guy on their team play worse and shoot a lot worse. So looking here, Antoine Walker went from 14 points a game down to 10. He shot 36% from the field compared to 43% during the regular season, which is a lot worse. Steve Nash went from averaging 15 and 9 to averaging 14 and 9, which is still pretty similar, but his shooting percentage went down from 47% in the regular season to 39% in the playoffs, which is worse, obviously. Antawn Jamison played a lot less, and he saw his numbers go down. He went from 15 points a game down to 13, and he shot 46% from the field compared to 54% in the regular season. Michael Finley went from averaging 19 points during the regular season down to 13, and went from shooting 44% during the regular season down to 38%. So, and then Josh Howard went from averaging 9 points a game in the regular season down to 5, and he went from shooting 43% down to 22%. So a big drop off there. So I think when you look at everything, guys who improved their play were Dirk and Daniels, so that's 2 guys. But significant guys whose play went down were Finley, Howard, Jamison, Nash, and Walker. 5 guys. So like out of their 7 main guys, 5 of them played worse in the playoffs and had worse shooting numbers. I think that's the big explanation for why they played worse. It's just that like the Kings defense was a lot better and the Mavs offense struggled, and I think that they struggled a bit because they didn't know who their 5th starter should be during the regular season. They did some Josh Howard. They did some Marquise Daniels. They did some Tony Delk. They did some of this guy named Danny Fortson. And they did some even Aguado Nanhara, Scott Williams, and Sean Bradley each had a few starts as well. But really, they just didn't know who to start the 5th guy. And so I think Josh Howard's confidence got shot quite a bit in the playoffs for not getting to start. Marquise Daniels played a ridiculous amount of minutes, though, 37 a game. But he really performed well, too. I mean, I don't blame them for playing him more because he played a lot better than anybody else did on that team that year. But really, I think the main difference that I haven't discussed yet but would be that Chris Webber didn't play in the year before, and he did in this coming season in the playoffs. If you look at his stats, in 2003, he was 23 points a game, and so when he didn't play in the playoffs, that was a big deal because the Kings were missing 23 points a game, and they just weren't as good, They had Peja averaging 23 a game in the playoffs, and Bibby averaging 13. Bobby Jackson was averaging 14, Divac 11, and Jim Jackson 11. But they really were sorely missing that Chris Webber 24 points a game. And if you go into the next season, he still wasn't as great, but his playoff stats were 18 points and 8 rebounds a game, which is still really good. And then they had everyone else performing at a pretty high level. Mike Bibby, 20 points a game. Peja Stojakovic, 18 points a game. Doug Christie, 14 points a game. Brad Miller, 10. Divac, 7. So those are their main guys right there, their main 6, you'd say. And they didn't have Bobby Jackson anymore, but they still played better because they did have Chris Webber back, who was more important than Bobby Jackson, obviously. And if you didn't know that, Bobby Jackson didn't play for them in the playoffs, but when he was playing for them, he was good. He was a good 6th man, but it's obviously more important to have Chris Webber back. So I think if you just look at the overall scenario, the Mavericks barely edged out the Kings without Chris Webber. So I think it's pretty reasonable that the Kings, with their best player back, would beat the Mavericks. Although Chris Webber did decline in talent a bit, and also the Mavericks did get better. So, it can't be explained very well why they lost. Their points per game average went down from 105 in the regular season down to 99 in the playoffs. But overall, just the Kings I think were a better team, and I think the Mavericks were definitely more talented, but I think the Kings were just a better team. Much like if you want a comparison for what that really means, like I'd say in the 2011 finals, the Mavericks were the better team, but the Heat were more talented. In this scenario, I'd say that the Kings were the better team, but the Mavericks definitely were more talented. I think that the Mavericks could have won that series easily. I could have seen them then go on to beat Minnesota in the semis, and then honestly, I could have seen them beat the Lakers in the conference finals and get to the finals, and then it could be a crapshoot between them and Detroit. I think that they were a title caliber team, and it's almost disappointing that with that solid of a team, that they didn't make it that very far. I would argue that they had 6 guys that on any given night could have a breakout game and score 20 points a game for you. But definitely Finley, Jamison, Dirk, Nash, and Walker could. And then I'd say Howard had his moments, and Daniels, not really in the regular season, but in the playoffs really came on strong. But yeah, guys, that's just a little video regarding the 2003 to 2004 Mavericks. As a bit of additional background, Steve Nash left after 2004 because the Mavs weren't willing to pay him. He went on to be have a lot of continued success. They kind of retooled in 2004. They got Devin Harris and Jason Terry and got rid of Jamison and Antoine Walker. But we're still a good team. And this year, I think the main problem that they had was just the West was a lot more talented than it had been, and then it would be later on. But you know, sometimes it just doesn't go your way. As we've seen recently in the NBA, really talented teams don't always perform great, you know. A lot of people thought that Toronto would get to the finals this year, and they lost in the second round. So I think it just goes to show you that no team is ever safe, and just having talent doesn't necessarily make you a good team. You have to have teamwork and chemistry. Those are just as important as talent sometimes. So yeah, I hope you guys found this informative and interesting, and that's all I got for you. So let me know if you have any thoughts on this subject in the comments, and I'd be glad to respond and have a little conversation about it with you. Have a good day, guys. Bye.